Welcome back, one and all, to our bi-weekly book club. We have been working our way through a book by Nicholas Miller, 500 Years of Protest and Liberty. And we're examining the history of religious liberty, especially in light of modern claims about America being a Christian nation and the rise to significant influence in our culture of something called Christian nationalism. And I'm reminded as we start our session today of a famous quote from the book 1984 by George Orwell, where he says, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." And part of the battle over the relationship between church and state, the battle in the culture wars, has been a battle over the understanding of the founding of the history of the founding of the American nation and of our Constitution in particular. And it is there that we turn our attention this week. Our guests, our colleagues here in this discussion, of course, the author of the book, Nicholas Miller, a professor at Andrews University, a rather accomplished lawyer, if I do say so myself, and our good friend and colleague, Ed Woods, who chairs the Conscience and Justice Council for the Seventh-day Adventist Church and serves as Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director in the Lake Region Conference. And I think that's good for introductions for today. I'm Alan Reinach, and I've been serving as Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director in the West, in California, for way too long, some would say, but still going strong.
And a very fine attorney as well. And we should put in there, works with the First Amendment litigation clinic at Stanford Law School. So
very much so. And my favorite new title, Nick, is co-chair of the Religious Liberty Committee of the American Bar Association, which has been a lot of fun in COVID times, planning and executing programming on the key First Amendment issues. But today we're going to look at, what did our founding fathers really do, both in the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights, as far as relations between church and state. Nick, where do you want to begin as far as did they really establish America somehow, acknowledging that we are a Christian nation or not?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And really, that's the title of our show, right? Is America a Christian nation? Myth and reality. And a lot of conservative Christians and some historians among them like to point out, and many Americans don't know this, but we take the First Amendment for granted, right? That the First Amendment protects our religious freedom, and it has the Establishment Clause that separates church and state. And so it does. But when originally drafted, the First Amendment did not apply to state governments. So all of you may remember the opening of the First Amendment is, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." And so there is a great deal of truth to the claim that the founders, while so some conservatives would say the founders wanted to prevent the establishment of a national church, right? They had left England. They didn't want an Anglican church or an American official church run by the federal government. But the reality was they were open to and wanted there to be an establishment of Christianity generally, not a church, but Christianity generally. And at the state level, you could have particular churches established by the state governments. And there, in fact, some, as you know, Alan, how many states continued to have established churches after the First Amendment was passed? Right?
Actually, very few. Most of them had already disestablished, and those that didn't, they disestablished in short order with Massachusetts being the exception. You know, the Puritan strongholds in New England held out. I think Connecticut was 1819 and Massachusetts was 1833. And the circumstances of those, I think, show the wisdom of separating church and state.
So in some ways, the argument that the conservative historians make now actually turns on itself, because they're right that the federal Constitution didn't disestablish religion at the local level, but
the states did themselves.
That's right. That's right. Almost all the states did it by the time of the Constitution, and there were just 2 or 3 that held out. And so it shows that this idea of separation had permeated not just from the federal level, but all the way through at the state level. But there's something very important about this federalism argument that relates not just to religious freedom, but also relates to the issue of slavery, right? And
how do you see that, Nick?
The what?
How do you see that? Because obviously the Constitution itself was this great compromise on race, and identified the black slaves primarily in the South, of course, as 3/5 of a person.
Correct.
For purposes of voting. They had no civil rights. They were not included in, the Bill of Rights protections, as it were, but they were still counted to some extent in order to protect the political power of the southern states.
Right. Edward probably has something to say about that, and then
it was more about like economic interests. And the compromise, as Nick articulated in his book, and as we all know, was that racism, discrimination, was the cost to pay. And that's what they had to give. And that's why we have the compromise. But I think something else, with regards to the federal government and the enforcement of, when the slaves became free, the federal government was the one holding the South accountable. The federal government was the one that Blacks saw as the protector of their civil rights at the time, until obviously the Reconstruction era. And so when you're taking a look at the federalism and the compromises that were made for economic interest, that's how racism became widespread, and the difference in racism between the North and the South in terms of the nuances. I don't think racism was just limited to the South. I mean, racism was also in the North. Right. But we saw the nuances when it came to economic interests, and as you're bringing out the compromise. But as an African American, historically, we've always believed the federal government would protect our rights better than states' rights.
So, but let's not overlook the point that happens later on, of course, Edward, after the Civil War. But before that, let's not overlook the fact that this federalism question is the same issue that prevents the Bill of Rights and the free exercise of religion from being applied across all the states.
Correct.
It's the same issue that allows slavery to continue in certain states, even while it's being outlawed in other states. In other words, the reason that federalism applies to the Bill of Rights and that religious freedom isn't protected at the local level and establishment is allowed to happen at the local level is not because the founders were in favor of establishing religion. They didn't want to establish it, the majority of them, but enough of them wanted to stop. If the Bill of Rights had applied to the states, then there would have been an argument that slavery should be over.
So I agree with that. I was responding. I thought Alan was talking about the 3/5 compromise.
Yeah, no, he was.
Okay.
No,
Sure.
Your point is very germane. But what I want us not to overlook is the fact that federalism was an argument that was that explains why religious freedom wasn't everywhere, and it was driven by the fact that the South and others wanted to keep slavery in place. So, in a sense, there's Martin Luther King says, justice denied everywhere is anywhere is justice denied everywhere. Mm-hmm. Well, at the very founding of our country, our religious freedom was truncated and limited because we also were wanting to impose slavery. So there was a trade-off, right? We certain people wanted to keep slavery, and they couldn't have religious freedom, right? This is a pretty powerful and profound point. the same federalism that protected people in the use of slavery also prevented people from having religious freedom. So the Christian nationalism that insisted on the ability for states to oversee and establish churches is the same Christian nationalism that compromised and allowed slavery to continue. So right at the beginning, we see Christian nationalism and the establishment of religion by the government being a kind of partner with the ongoingness of slavery.
Well, Nick,
Well, let me ask you this question though, because this is, if when we initially started the conversation, we mentioned that religious freedom, in terms of the combination of church and state, did not preclude the states from doing it, but the federal government could not do it. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And so, as a result, religious freedom, if I'm hearing, I will make sure I'm getting this correctly.
Yeah.
Could not be ensured at the national level.
Exactly.
But it could be at the state level if the state decided to do a state religion.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Now, I think both of you kind of got that mixed up, but because we had the First Amendment thoroughly protected religious freedom at the federal level. The states were free to trample on religious freedom broadly if they wanted to. They didn't.
Or protect it. They could
protect it.
Or protect it. And I think that's what Edward said. Yeah.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is we said that Congress shall not establish a national religion, correct?
No. Congress shall not establish
any religion.
Anything to do with religion. The Establishment Clause is broad. It's not just a national religion.
Okay, but I guess my understanding, they could not. I guess they could not establish a national church. Correct?
That's certainly true.
Okay,
Yeah.
and so my point is that by them not being able to establish a national church, they were basically separating church and state
At the federal national
at the federal level.
Yes.
But it did not say Congress or states. It just said Congress.
Correct. Yes.
So I'm trying to make sure, Alan, we're on the same page because I'm not sure.
And the reason this is connected to slavery is because neither could the federal government outlaw slavery at the state level, just like they couldn't establish a
national religion. They basically left it up to the states.
They left it up to the states. Exactly. So
and
there's
as a result,
slavery.
They could continue with slavery in the South because that nuance wasn't in the language wasn't there to prevent them from doing so.
And they could continue with religious establishment in the North.
Correct.
So you see the connection between religious establishment and slavery.
All right. But coming back to this national church myth, I want to make two quick points. First, nobody wanted a national church at that time. It wasn't really an issue. You know, the Anglican Church had been dominant in some of the states like Virginia, but England lost the war. So, the Anglican Church was not exactly favored, right? There was a number of drafts of the First Amendment, and one of them referenced a national church, and it wound up on the cutting room floor. In other words, it was rejected. And so what people are doing today is they're going back to rejected language and saying, see, that's what they really meant, instead of, they could have said it that way and they rejected it. The other point I think is very significant is the first opportunity that the United States had publicly, officially, legally to express itself when it comes to religion was in resolving a conflict, a mercantile conflict with pirates in the Mediterranean from Tripoli, a Muslim country that had been attacking American merchant vessels there in the Mediterranean. And the administration of George Washington negotiated a treaty with Tripoli. It wasn't finished by the time he left office and John Adams came in. The Adams administration the Senate ratified the treaty when Adams was president. and I believe it's Article 8 of the treaty that says in no uncertain terms that America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. And why was that in a treaty with a Muslim nation? Because it was expressing the notion that we have no inherent hostility to any other nation because of religious differences.
Yep.
And that was a very significant expression right at the beginning. That conflict, by the way, is what launched the establishment of the American Navy. Up until that time, we had no Navy, but it was apparent that we needed one.
So this is a great point, Alan, and I think it relates to the question that our program is based on: is America a Christian nation? That, as you've expressed it well, America, at its beginning, as a federal national nation, rejected the idea that it was based somehow, the federal government, on a commitment to Christianity. That as a legal
Correct.
matter, there was not a civil basis to argue that America had to implement Christian laws or had to oppose the enemies of Christianity. And that's what they said in this treaty that was ratified by Congress, as I think you've already expressed. But if you think about America being a Christian nation socially and culturally, right, that's a different matter. Was America a Christian nation socially and culturally? And I think there we have an answer where we can say yes, right? The primary influence on most people's view of transcendence and of religion and Christianity had a tremendous role and place and influence in the way people thought about life, in the way they organized society, and even the way they drafted laws, not to impose religion, but to respect the morality of this Christian people in the way they related to each other. So the trick to the answer to the question is really, is America a Christian nation, or was America a Christian nation, is really yes and no, or no and yes. Mm-hmm. And we have to make those important points because...
All right, but Nick,
yeah,
we've got to distinguish between what we call cultural Christianity and the genuine article itself. Because going back to you made a powerful linkage between the federalism that was necessary to restrict the federal authority to deal with religious liberty at the state level, and it did that in order to protect the rights of states in their interactions and their laws and customs regarding imported African American slaves. Now, today, many of the harshest critics of Christian nationalism see that link, that Christian nationalism has retained an inherently racist, linkage or undertone, that it's essentially linked with a kind of white supremacy, white nationalism, as well as Christian. And going back to the culture of colonial America, yes, it was strongly dominated by Christian culture, but it was a Christian culture that in many places made its peace with slavery. And therefore, we have to distinguish between the cultural expression of Christianity and the genuine article, which, the Sermon on the Mount is very significant. It's almost the Bill of Rights or the Constitution of the New Testament, and yet it has never been taken seriously in Christian culture.
Well, no, that's a fair and an important and a good point. But I would say at the time of the founding, the most religious part of the country, New England, where the Puritans were, was also the least committed and the most opposed to slavery. Right? In the southern colonies, it was Anglicanism was the religion, and it was an established religion, and they were supportive of slavery. But to be fair, the Puritans, by the time of the writing of the Constitution in the Northeast, most of those northern states had outlawed slavery. So we can't draw a direct connection between Christian nationalism or in all places and slavery. And yet I would put it this way, and this was said a number of times during our last presidential administration. The Puritans didn't necessarily promote slavery, but they were willing to make a compromise with it
Correct.
protect their own interests, right? And to benefit from it, at least indirectly, many of them anyway. And so in that way, Christian nationalism becomes an aider and supporter of slavery, even where it's not directly promoting it. And then certainly as to Anglicanism and the established churches of the South, your point is fully an important one. But still, to see this difference between a legal establishment and a social kind of support and establishment helps us understand that there's been two kinds of disestablishment of a religion in America. One was at the founding, the legal disestablishment, which, as you and I have discussed, Alan, happened at the federal level with the federal constitution and at the state level within a decade or two. But then there is a longer term social disestablishment of religion. Harvard and Yale and Columbia and Dartmouth were all founded as religious institutions. They're private colleges. There's nothing in civil law that requires them to become the secular institutions they are today. It is the loss of the influence of Christianity by personal private choice that has caused there to be a social moving away, a secularization of America that is separate from the legal disestablishment. It has to do with a series of private choices and influences by what were formerly religious people and institutions.
I guess I would want to ask the question, Nick, when you've talked about legal or government and then you talk about social, you're also well aware that the Pew Forum every 2 years or so talks about religious freedom, and they identify countries by government restrictions and they identify countries by social restrictions. And hearing what you just said, would it be a jump? But I think that what you're saying historically could still be aligned today as we look at those lists when it talks about religious freedom. Because the issue with religious freedom as it relates to the North and the issue with religious freedom as it relates to the South, especially dealing with slavery, and then seeing the social conditions and the compromises that were made, as we just said, in the North and South, and now linking that to contemporary times, because people are paying attention to the government restrictions in these countries, as well as the social restrictions mainly being around Asian countries, and the government restrictions regularly around Middle East countries and Northern Africa. Do you see some similarities? Am I just off base?
No, that's a great point, Edward. I mean, there can be a positive social establishment of religion. Like, I think it's fine when there's colleges that choose to be religious, right, and create institutions that support particular confessional views of the Bible, whether they be Jewish or Christian or Muslim institutions. But a problem arises when private institutions can impose their will in a way on persons that aren't members of either their religion or their university. And I'll give you an example from the secular world today. So big tech is a private actor, Google and Facebook and so on and so forth. But big tech is beginning to make choices about not just conservative political views, but also about certain religious views that they no longer view as appropriate or acceptable. And I've had friends, leaders in the Adventist Church, whose Facebook pages or web pages have been deplatformed and shut down, despite being very innocent and not anything radical. This is an example of social establishment of secularism, if you will, that is invading our freedoms, even though the government can't do that. And that's something to be concerned with, as you've suggested.
Thank you.
Let me bring the conversation back this way, because the First Amendment reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And by and large, with very, very few exceptions for those of us who've actually studied the history of this, Americans don't know what is meant by an establishment of religion. We may think, okay, a religious school or a religious hospital is, because it's an establishment, right? If, we think of a restaurant as an establishment, a business might be an establishment. But I think it's really important if we're going to wrestle with the history, to look at, in the context of colonial America, what were the types of religious establishments that were present in colonial life, and that were eliminated or objected to in the process of disestablishing the church. Nick, can you give us some examples?
Well, yeah, and that kind of brings us to chapter 9 in the book, where I deal with a series of myths about what establishment or disestablishment did or did not mean. There's a famous author, David Barton, who's written books and claiming that the founders were deeply religious, that they established a Christian nation, and so on and so forth. And the Establishment Clause was merely meant to protect religion from government, but didn't prevent religions from putting their values into government. And this whole chapter goes through a series of myths about their claims. Separation of church and state isn't in the Constitution, and the wording isn't there, but the Establishment Clause itself was attempting to do just that. And the kind of disestablishment, and a good example of this is Madison and Jefferson's role in Virginia in opposing Patrick Henry's bill about the state supporting teachers of the Christian religion. And they often like to say, well, establishment would be just establishing one denominational church, but the state could support all religions equally, for instance. But that's what this bill in Virginia was attempting to do. Patrick Henry said every religion will be given funds to support the teachers and preachers of their own choosing. And you could decide which church. It was kind of like a voucher system for religion. And both Jefferson and Madison said, no, this establishment doesn't just have to do with establishing one denomination. It has to do with the government choosing to aid and advance and further religion. All religion
with tax dollars,
with taxpayer money. And so we have a kind of miniature example in the state of Virginia of how many of the founders thought about establishment and it being this broader prohibition of government choosing to advance or endorse a particular religion or all religions equally. So that's a great example, and it's part of.
And it wasn't just restricted to Virginia, because there were a number of states that had more than one denomination that was on the government dole, that was essentially had official status and funding from the state. It also completely ignores the Baptist religious objections to all these establishments. In New England, at one point, Massachusetts says, okay, well, if you have a Baptist church in the town, your tax dollars can go to support your own church. And the Baptists objected to being taxed even for the support of their own church, because their commitment was to the principle of voluntarism in religion, that, coercive taxation to support religion was immoral and unbiblical in their view. And I would say, as Adventists, we don't use the same language that they do in terms of voluntarism, but we hold the same principles.
Well, it's interesting, the Land of the Brave highlighted that when you talk about religions, we talk about America being a Christian religion, specifically in the middle colonies, Jews were prevalent. They're prevalent in Delaware, prevalent in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And so, it's not whether or not is America a Christian nation, maybe is America a religious nation, because we all know Jews are not Christians, but yet Jews were a part of the founding of the middle colonies.
Present company accepted, of course.
Well, we love you, Alan. I'm just we're having this discussion,
right?
And you're reading it. I'm not. You guys are way up on it more than I am. I'm having to study it and catch up with you guys because you're brilliant. But when you're really looking at it, this we're talking about some of the foundings and making it contemporary, and I agree and I support it. But I'm also, like, hey, wait a minute, Jews were here too, and so. it's not, just a Christian nation. It's also, I mean, a lot of our conversation is really dealing with, or is the religious freedom and obviously the Establishment Clause, but those are some of the things, but it was more than just a Christian nation.
Well, and that's why many on the religious right like to talk about a Judeo-Christian nation. They kind of want to sweep it all together and include the Jews in that. But let me ask you this question, Alan. Maybe this is where you're headed, maybe not. But what happens? We left the conversation with the First Amendment not applying to the states, either for slavery or for religion. Now, what happens that at some point the First Amendment does become applied to the states? And how does that happen? And how does it impact both slavery and religious freedom? And is there a tie between the two?
There absolutely is. So the first thing that happens is something called the Civil War, right?
Small.
Just a minor blip in American history, right? And in the context of the Civil War, Congress ratifies a number of amendments to the Constitution, and the 14th Amendment purporting to now guarantee the rights of the people as against state action that would infringe on those rights. And over the next century, particularly beginning in the early decades of the 20th century, the Supreme Court takes on a number of cases that begin to do what the legal scholars call incorporate the Bill of Rights through the 14th Amendment and apply them to the states. And so a number of them, including the First Amendment's prohibitions on restricting free speech and freedom of the press and assembly and religion and some of the others, all the cases about Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment law and whether criminal authorities are violating people's rights with illegal searches and seizures and such. We would never have that without the 14th Amendment applying the Bill of Rights to what happens in state and local government. So this has been well ingrained, and part of what we see in this Christian nationalist movement is an effort really to undo the effect of the Civil War and go back to antebellum status quo of states' rights with little effective oversight or interference from the federal government.
Let me just make a point quickly here, and I want to let Edward comment on this as well, because this is very important. But to summarize what you've said, when we ended slavery, we made it possible for the other rights in the Constitution to also be enjoyed by all Americans. So yes, keeping slavery alive not only enslaved Black Americans, but prevented Americans of all colors from receiving the robust protections of all of the Bill of Rights. And it wasn't until we ended slavery that we unlocked the key to actually allowing other freedoms to be enjoyed by all Americans. And it's also, as a historian, Alan, I find it extremely fascinating that it really wasn't until the decision about the First Amendment and the Free Exercise Clause really doesn't start being applied to the states meaningfully until maybe the Bias decision during World War II. But even later than that, Sherbert versus Werner and the proliferation doesn't really happen until the 1960s, after civil rights legislation has happened and greater fairness is brought to us on racial and ethnic issues. And I think it's important to see this point that MLK has made, that when you unjustly treat a group of people, somehow that has larger impacts on society and limits the freedoms of everybody. And we can see that historically. Edward, I'm sure you'll have a comment on this.
Well, when you said, the 14th Amendment applying to everyone, obviously that resonated well with me in our conversation that we're talking about. But then going back to Nick's point, although we had these amendments, they really weren't realized for people of color until the 1960s. The Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act is challenged in the 2013. Now, as a result of last year's election, you're seeing these sweeping bills across states trying to restrict voter access and all these things coming back, coming around right now, and whether or not we need to do, with regards to what's happening in Georgia, what's happening here in Michigan. The Brennan Center, lists all the states where voting laws are under attack right now as a result of last year's election. There's a new phenomenon that I learned about, when we're talking about voting rights and this whole Make America Great Again, where we have now split up the traditional Democrats and the traditional Republicans. Now we have what's called Trump Republicans and Sanders Democrats. And, and now that's being talked about, and the differences, with regards to the two distinct different groups. And, with regards to, let's just take the COVID vaccination, it just came out this weekend that, we have more vaccines than people are taking it. And the people that are not taking the vaccines are religious minorities and basically Trump Republicans. And so, once again, that's interesting again as well. But I understand Alan's point. And I understand Nick's tie as relates to, the Martin Luther King and the civil rights. But what's interesting to me, Nick, and we've talked about it before, is the relevance of your book, in 2016, and how 5 years later, not only do we see the ties in terms of what's happening in the country, but we see it historically. They can also apply it not just to civil rights, but also to religious freedom. And for me, who's into the Pew Research and the Forum, the government restricted social restrictions, I find that beneficial. I appreciate that tie. For what's happening in America with regards to, 9 minutes and 20 seconds, the Chauvin verdict. Then we went from the Chauvin verdict to the shooting in Columbus, Ohio, then the shooting in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, then the shooting with Adam Toledo in Chicago. All of this stuff, in a way, Nick, you are a prophet, in some of these things. But it just, for me, the benefit is the tie to contemporary times, looking at it from a historical standpoint, but not limited just to religious freedom, but also to civil rights as well. So I appreciate that.
So, Nick, thinking about the clock here and kind of a couple of bigger picture points, I want to take it back. In 1800, Timothy Dwight was the president of Yale, which, as you pointed out at the time, was a profoundly Christian Calvinist institution. And he was very concerned that the removal of government support, financial support, and establishment of religion would have a very detrimental effect on religion in America. And the reality, a couple of decades later, America experienced yet another profound religious revival, the Second Great Awakening. And Timothy Dwight was pleasantly surprised and delighted that he had been wrong. And that, in fact, when the principle of voluntarism became kind of the universal norm, and religion had to sustain itself by its own inherent worth, there was explosive growth, both exponential growth, both numerically, but also in terms of the quality of people's devotion and experience. And by contrast, we look at Europe, where where Christianity has long been established in either Protestant or Catholic forms, and they are decidedly post-Christian, while America remains as a very confusing, but certainly a very vigorous religious sector here. And so I think looking at the social aspects, we can say confidently, the lessons of history show the value of keeping government out of the business of religion, of keeping the two separate, of letting religion be a voluntary enterprise, unsupported by tax dollars. And of course, the big conflict today is that with government funding so much of everything and religion having its hand out and wanting what it considers its fair share of funding for its institutions, but not wanting the inevitable regulations that go with the funding. And that's where the real sort of rubber is meeting the road these days. You know, you want the strings without them being strangling.
So this is a great point, Alan, that we talked earlier about a legal establishment versus a social cultural influence of religion. And I think that what you're pointing out is correct, that where you've had a legal establishment in the West, you actually undermine, you weaken the social cultural power of religion. And where religion is not established, but is protected, right? A benevolent disestablishment, which is important. It's not like France, where you're going to expunge religion from the public square, from being publicly expressed. It's a benevolent disestablishment where you protect religion, you give freedom to religious groups and minorities, and where you do that, you get a much more robust social and cultural expression of religion, which is much healthier. So you look at Canada. Religion was mostly established there throughout the province of Canada, still is in some places. Secularism is incredibly strong. Religion is very much on its heels and is much less influence. So America, so the religious right that is calling for more government support and endorsement and promotion of religion, you know, our last president saying, I'm going to put you back in the position of influence, insofar as he was talking legally, he actually was threatening the long-term actual influence and power of religion, because it's a trade-off. If you get that political power, you almost always lose social and cultural relevance and influence. And of course, you need the protections. You need to have freedom to exercise religion. And you alluded to something, Alan, our state has become so complex. It used to be healthcare institutions and educational institutions were all run privately. Well, it's a big business. Individuals can't run hospitals. And so the government is becoming involved in some places where traditionally private institutions ran them. And it's almost impossible to run them, including our educational institutions. Federal grants and loans, like 90% of our students are dependent on those in some way. And my feeling is, as long as that's going indirectly, as long as all students are getting funds to support their education, and then are making truly independent and private choices to attend whatever institutions are available, whether they be religious or secular, that kind of indirect support, I have come to believe, is not only acceptable, but is a form, if you prevent it, it does become a form of religious discrimination against individuals and their religious choices. So,
well, I'm smiling because I'm thinking back to the voucher case, the Zellman case, and I know I filed a brief in opposition, but somehow I thought that you were in opposition as well at that time.
Well, I think I did have some things to say about it in opposition. I probably am concerned that vouchers will come with strings, right? Mm-hmm. That will limit the mission of the schools. And I'm more concerned about that at the primary and secondary level than at the collegiate level.
Correct.
Where there's greater independence and ability of the institution to function. So anyway, we've probably come to the end of our time here. I do appreciate the engagement of you gentlemen. We're going to have, we haven't come to the end of the book by any means, but I think we're going to perhaps do one more program and take a break over the summer. And at this next program, we focused on the dangers of Christian nationalism. But I think that we also have to recognize that there is a threat to Christianity and religion from an excessive and overly robust secularism, right? Having a secular government is fine, but having a government that is committed to the ideologies of secularism and having a society that is committed to those ideologies can threaten religion. So we have, if we look at the early modern period, late modern period, the medieval church that is imposing religion. But with the French Revolution, we have the rise of a secular outlook that now threatens true spirituality from the opposite direction. And in America, in some ways, we're caught between these two poles. Those of us conversant with prophecy in the book of Daniel sometimes talk about this as the king of the north and the king of the south. The king of the north being an absolutist religious perspective, but the king of the south being a secularist absolutist perspective. And we have to say that in our political world today, I would say we see both of these forces in operation. And next time we will have a closer look at the manifestations of extreme forms of secularism that are currently challenging and I believe jeopardizing the freedom of religion in our societies.
Well, and I'm sitting here in California in ground zero for the battle at the state level.
Right.
So it's a
But I
good
also
discussion
think
to finish with.
and I'm looking forward to this discussion, but we also have to understand, how has the church given a rise to secularism for failure to act?
Yeah. No, I think
Oh man.
it'd be worth talking about as well, for sure. So,
All right.
well, perhaps we can have a quick prayer here at the end. Edward, would you do us the favor?
Sure. Lord, we thank you, we praise you, we magnify you, and we lift you up. Lord, as we talk about the foundings of this nation, it still doesn't change who you are. It still doesn't change your plan of salvation and your desire to see all of us saved and none of us to perish. So, Lord, as we go through these truths, help us, oh God, to know that you're not here just to save the oppressed, but also the oppressor as well. So help may our light shine so much that men can see your good works and glorify you, O God, which art in heaven. Please give a special blessing to Alan and to Nick and to Jana and to everyone that has watched this broadcast. Help him, O God, to see things clearly and know that your coming is sooner than we first believe. And we'll be mindful and careful in giving you the praise, the honor, and the glory. In the worthy and matchless name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
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 Thank you, Edward. That was very nice. And for those that would like to see this program or share it with friends or see the older programs that we've recorded, the Lake Union Conference Religious Liberty Facebook page has these videos there that you can access and watch and share. So until next time, keep doing the right thing through the grace of God.